Amen. So here's the thing. Unless you are living on like a deserted island by yourself, or you're like a person just out in the mountains, like total hermit, just living by yourself alone, if you're ever around people, there's one thing that is certain: conflict. It's inevitable. It's going to happen, right? Because as long as you got two sinners rubbing shoulders in the same room, there's going to be an issue at some point in time. Would you agree with me? Conflict is a real big problem. It happens all over the place, right? It's everywhere in the world you look. Every single place you look. And I don't know about you, but it seems like to me, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me like the world is more divided today than it has been for a at least very long time. So many polar opposite opinions, such differences of views that there's people just in conflict everywhere we look. And I think the presence of the internet and social media and all that stuff is just making it more, it's like gasoline on the fire, right? Conflict is just, it seems like it's just everywhere. People's different views, their different personalities, their different understandings of how to handle and situations and ideas of what the solution to the problem might be. There's just so much difference of views and opinions. And before you know it, there's conflict everywhere you look. And for many of us, we see it in our maybe their place of work. We see it in our neighborhood, maybe. You see it, in the church. And you even see it in your own home or with family members or really close friends even sometimes. And conflict can be really, really difficult. And you wonder, is there any hope when the damage is done, when a relationship is broken? Is there any hope that this relationship can be restored, that we can bring peace to this situation? How in the world are we going to resolve all this? And I want to tell you today that the answer is yes, there is hope, because Jesus is our hope, and Jesus gives us peace. And so but we've been in the series talking about what Jesus is for, and today I want to talk about this, is that Jesus is for peace. Jesus is for peace. Jesus is a peacemaker, and he calls us to be peacemakers too. But most of us, we aren't really equipped to how to handle conflict. We don't know what to do when we're in conflict. So I want to look at what Jesus taught us about conflict, about peace, and how we can restore broken and damaged relationships that conflict has created a wall between. So if you have a Bible, Matthew chapter 5, verse 9, this is what Jesus says. He's in the Sermon on the Mount. He's preaching the greatest sermon ever. And he begins with what we call the Beatitudes. And in Matthew 5:9, one of them is this. He says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." Blessed are the peacemakers. Jesus says you're called to be a peacemaker. If you want to call yourself a son of God, if you want to be a son of God or a daughter of God, you need to be a peacemaker. That's an identifying mark of what it means to be a son or a daughter of God, is that you're a peacemaker. Now, that's really interesting, isn't it? Christians, we're called to be peacemakers. But are Christians today, by the world standards, by the way people view us, are we known for being peacemakers? Sadly, and maybe ironically, I don't know. Most of the world, they look at Christians, they go, they're the angry ones. They're the ones who are causing all these problems in the world. They're the ones who are always against what we want to do. And they don't always see. Look, I think there's thousands, maybe millions of Christians out in the world being peacemakers every day. But that doesn't make the headlines, does it? Christian makes peace. Resolves dispute with their spouse, right? That's not on the headlines. You don't post about that on social media, right? What do we see? The stuff that makes the headlines is the hyper-judgmental, angry ones with the megaphones yelling at people that they're going to hell. Yeah, that's good TV right there, right? What makes the news is the ones who are just yelling at everybody on social media because they don't agree with their opinions, and the anger and the conflict and the disputes. That's what people see. But they don't see that there's Christians making peace every single day in their offices and with their friends and at their neighborhoods and in their families. They don't see that. That's what Christians are called to do. We should be known for peace. But the problem is, making peace is hard. Would you agree? Making peace is so difficult when the conflict is there, when the relationship is strained. How do you bring peace to these situations? And so to understand how that is, first we got to get to the root of what causes conflict among us. And if you look in the Bible, James chapter 4, verse 1 and 2 says this: "What causes conflict and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel." So according to this, The root of our conflict is our desires. It's our passions. And the root of conflict is when our desires and our passions are at war within us. And so if you think about it this way, when we have conflict with other people, it's because we have conflicting desires. I desire this, but they desire that. Conflict. I want this, but that's not being met. I'm feeling conflict because that person's not meeting my expectation of what I desire for them to do. Conflict. And so these unmet desires, unmet expectations, whatever, can lead to this war within us that bursts out in our attitudes and our actions and our words and the way that we handle our situations with other people, and conflict arises. This is battle of desires. I think of it this way, the classic fight in my marriage. My wife will say to me, Brandon, what do you want to do for dinner? Oh no, tread carefully, right? I'll say, pizza sounds good. And she says, well, I don't want pizza. Oh no. I'm like, well, what do you want? Well, I don't know. Well, how about Chinese? Chinese sounds good. I don't want Chinese. Conflict, right? If you're married, you know this is what I'm talking about, right? That one question, all of a sudden, it's like we have different desires. What do we do? She wants something. I don't want that, and it can be conflict. And that's kind of a silly, minor way that I think about it. But think about it, right? Maybe a wife desires to have a good conversation with her husband, but he desires the screen on his phone. Conflict. There's a war of desires right there, right? Maybe you're at work and you desire for your coworkers, your teammates to show up on time, and they desire to never use an alarm clock. Conflict, right? For me, maybe I desire to put out a glorious Green Bay Packer flag outside my home, and my neighbor puts up a Vikings flag. Conflict, right? Pastor Bill is a Viking fan, and I'm a Packers fan, and so there's conflict, there's tension in the office. It's how do we work through that? We have different desires. We have different ideas of how things should work, of what we think other people should believe, what we desire for the world to be like, what we desire for other people to how they should act, how they should behave, how they should live their lives. And when that doesn't realize, there's conflict, there's difficulty. So what do we do with those situations? It can before we know it, it can overflow and become a big, big problem and a tension in that relationship. So I want to give credit where credit's due. Much of what I'm saying and much of what my thinking has really been informed by this little book. I love this book. It's called Resolving Everyday Conflict. If you haven't read this book yet, I recommend it. The best thing about this book, if you're not a reader, it's short. Okay, like 100 pages, and the pages are small too. So it's like, if you're not much of a reader, it's still one to check out. If you want to go a little bit deeper, I can't get into everything, but there's some good stuff in there if you're looking for a resource. If you're dealing with some conflict and you want some extra help, I recommend checking it out. But one of the things when I was reading this book that really helped me kind of understand is that when we as humans face danger, we have like one or two different ways that we naturally respond. One or two ways that we naturally respond, okay? You've probably heard of this before. Either we fight or what? Flight. Yeah, you've heard this before, right? Either fight or flight. How do we respond to danger? It's either we attack it or we run from it, right? So imagine this. You're out in the desert. It's a beautiful day. It is not 120 degrees outside. It's nice. It's like a few months from now, right? And you're up hiking up in a mountain somewhere, and you're enjoying your day, but then you see a mountain lion coming towards you. What do? How many of you are flight people? I heard a few people like run. How many of you are flight people? Come on, be honest. Who's a flight person? All right. How many of you are a fight person? You're like, I am punching that lion in the face, and I'm bringing home a trophy, right? Some people are that way. So what do, right? We have a natural reaction. Some people run, some people attack, some people defend themselves, some people get out of there, right? The way this works in my family, my wife, she's sitting over here, she's a flight person. She always is like, she tells me this classic joke all the time. She's like, I don't have to outrun that. I just got to outrun you. Fair enough, right? And for me, I'm more of a fighter, right? I may not go attack the mountain lion, but I'm going to hold my ground. If it comes at me, it's on. Right? I'm going to defend my family. I'm going to throw my life down to try to protect people from that thing. That's just kind of the way that I react. I laugh because my daughter, I'm trying to figure out what she is. But she's not really fight. She's not really flight. Like when she was really, really little, she'd be running around the house, and I would like hide behind something and jump out like, bah! And I'd scare her. And she would just like, ah! And then poof, hit the ground, just fall over, right? Even to this day, she's a teenager now, and I'll do it every once in a while. I'll jump out and scare her and just, fall over every time. And so we joke with her, we're like, you're not fight or flight, you're just flail and fall. Like, I don't know if there's a category for that one. I'm trying to figure it out. But here's the point, okay? Here's the point in all this. When we face danger, we have a natural inclination, however we're wired, however God created us, that we're either fighters or we're flighters. We're either going to attack the problem or we're going to run from the problem. And the same thing happens when we face conflict. When we face conflict, we see that conflict as a threat. And we're either going to run from it or we're going to attack it, depending on how we're wired. And so if you're more of a flight kind of person, you tend to see that conflict as a threat, as a danger to be avoided, because you don't want it to hurt you or you don't want it to hurt other people, right? So you're trying to get away from it. You're trying to avoid conflict, doing everything you can not to engage so that you can stay safe and away from that thing. Often this means that you can just get out of there, or you just don't engage in things that should be that maybe are in front of you that could cause conflict. Sometimes this gets to the point where you even start denying that the conflict even exists, and that can be problematic, can't it? Just put on a smile, act like everything's fine. Don't let everybody know that inside that desires and those passions is warring within you. It's tearing you up inside. Now, the problem with this is often conflict can get to the point where you're just focused mostly on me. You're thinking about yourself, like what's easiest for me? It's easier to avoid the conflict than to engage with it. It's more safe for me just to not engage and to get away from there than to deal with the conflict. So often you're thinking about me and just avoiding the conflict entirely. And the problem with this is if you let the conflict, that's especially a severe conflict, you leave that just sitting there and festering long enough, eventually it grows and it gets bigger and it gets worse because you've never dealt with the big conflict that's there. Sometimes it means you're bottling it up so much inside you, and sometimes you're so good at hiding the conflict that the person that you have conflict with doesn't even know you've got conflict. And as all of a sudden it's bottled up so long for so many years that suddenly they say something and you just, blah, it just explodes, right? And they're like, where did that come from? And they didn't realize that you've been dealing with this for a long time and just not telling anybody about it. So it can manifest in some very destructive and in bad ways if you're not careful with this. Now, I'm not saying that sometimes when there is conflict, sometimes stepping away from the situation is a wise thing to do, to clear your head when you're getting angry, right? To pray about it, to get things right, to seek God for directions and answers of how I should engage in this conflict. But the healthy part is going back and saying, okay, I still need to address this and deal with this just with a cooler head after I've stepped away for a little bit. And then if you're a fight person, on the other hand, if you're a fight person, you see the conflict as a danger that needs to be destroyed. It's a danger that you need to beat, that you need to win, that you need to have victory over. You need to address the situation, and you need to overcome this threat. And so if you're not careful, what that leads to is you start attacking the person. You start maybe verbally attacking the person. Maybe you even physically attack the person because you're so angry and upset and wanting to deal with that conflict. And if you're not careful, what that can lead to is you can maybe win the argument because you were right, but you lose the relationship. You hurt the person. You can leave people behind you hurting and broken because you attacked the person. You didn't just attack the problem. You went after them and you won, but you lost. The relationship's torn and ruined behind you. The fight mindset can also lead to blaming the other person. It's not just attacking, but sometimes it's just blaming. Well, you did this, you did that, you did this. And what it really can stem from is your focus isn't necessarily on me, it's on them. It's on that person, what they did, what they said, how they said it. And you start kind of litigating all the problems like a good lawyer, right? Here's all the things you did wrong, and here's my evidence against you, and here's the logical reasons that I am correct, and you were wrong, and what you said, and how you did it, and you shouldn't do this, and you always, right? And before you know it, you're just causing more harm than you are good. And so the good side of the fight tendency is you want to address the conflict. The bad side and the dangerous side is you can address it so much that you're destroying the person and ruining the relationship. So here's the point with this. Whether you're a fight person or you're a flight person, both natural tendencies can lead to some serious dysfunction in relationships, regardless of which side you're on. And the point to this is we don't need to go down the natural paths. What we need is something better. What we need is to go the supernatural route and resolve the conflict, not by fight or flight, getting our focus off of me and them and focusing on Christ. Because he alone can bring peace to these situations. He alone can bring peace to our brokenness and our dysfunction. And so we get our focus off of ourselves and off of them and off of everything else, and we put our focus on Jesus. That's the biblical way to respond to conflict. So when you see this tension coming up and that you're tempted to fight or you're tempted to run, we need to stop and focus on Christ. How would he want us to handle the situation? What would Jesus want us to do? How would he want us to resolve this? How would he want us to talk to this person and deal with this conflict? And when you do this, when you're focused on Christ, you realize that Jesus is our peace. He's the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, and the Prince of what? He's the Prince of Peace. Jesus is the Prince of Peace. And so as Christians, as followers of the Prince of Peace, we need to be all about peace as well, just like Jesus is. And we realize that the gospel of Jesus, the good news of Jesus Christ, is the power for peace in our lives, not just between us and God, but also between us and the people around us. Look at this, Ephesians chapter 2, 14 through 18. It says, "For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of the two, so making peace, and might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross, thereby killing the hostility. And he came and preached peace to you who are far off and peace to those who are near, for through him we both have access in one spirit to the Father." Through Jesus and what he did, what he accomplished on the cross is made peace possible. First of all, he makes peace between us and God, right? You got to understand that before you became a Christian, before you've repented and turned to Jesus for your salvation, you're an object of wrath. Right? God's wrath was poured out towards you because you're a sinner. You're sinful. You've rebelled against God. You've broken his trust. You've betrayed him. You've rebelled against the King of Kings. You've rebelled against a righteous and holy God, and you're worthy of judgment. And that's a scary place to be. But because of Jesus, because of what he did for us, he took that penalty that we deserved, and he paid it. He died on that cross for our sins, and by his blood, we can be forgiven because of what he did for us. He paid that penalty so that we could be forgiven, so that we could be free, and so that we could then have peace with God. You know, the story of the Bible is a story of peace. The Hebrew word for peace is shalom. And if you read your Bible and you look for peace throughout it, you'll see this theme kind of woven all throughout Scripture. Very early in the very, very beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There's the Garden of Eden. It's in perfect peace, perfect shalom. Everything's great. Then sin enters the world, right? The human sin, and it causes all sorts of problems. Immediately, there's rifts, there's conflict, there's fighting, there's murder. It's bad. But God sent his one and only son, Jesus, right? God came down, took flesh, and he paid that penalty for us so that we could be forgiven, so that we could then be restored and reconciled to God. We could have peace. And then one day, as we grow older and eventually we die, because we have Christ in our lives, because he has saved us, we can be in perfect peace in paradise with God in heaven. It's a beautiful story of peace broken, conflict, and then restored. And so that's what Jesus did for us. And when we understand that, then we can extend peace out to other people as well. Look at this. Colossians chapter 1, verse 19 says this, "For in him," Jesus, "all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. And you who were once alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he is now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him." So because of what Jesus did for us, we can stand before God holy and blameless, not because we're holy and blameless, but because he is. And he paid that penalty for us. It's incredible, right? So Christians, we need to be agents of peace. We need to be people of peace because Jesus is the Prince of Peace, and he made peace between us and God possible, and peace between us and others possible. A way that I like to think of it is this way: Christians are the most forgiven, so we should be the most forgiving. We're the most forgiven people, so we should be the most forgiving. Just think about all the times you've messed up. Think about all the times that you've sinned, all the times you've rebelled against God, all the times that you've had terrible thoughts and done terrible things, and just all the times that you've fallen short of the glory of God. That's a big pile of stuff. But God's forgiven us, right? And not just all the sins we've ever done in the past, everything that we do in the present, and all the times that we're going to continue to sin in the future because we're still imperfectly trying to live it out. We've been forgiven more than anybody else on the planet as believers. So we should be the most forgiving people. Because how dare we say, "God, forgive me," and then we say, "I'm never forgiving you." God's forgiven me of so much. How can I not forgive someone else of so little? And that's the perspective we need to have as believers when we go into conflict. What did Jesus do for us? Get our eyes off of ourselves and off of the situation and focus on Christ, who has forgiven us, has been gracious to us, he's been merciful to us. Look at this, Colossians chapter 3, verse 12 and 13. Put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Oh, that's a hard one. I struggle with patience. Bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. That's the attitude we need to have when we come to conflict. Patient, kind, compassionate, gracious, because God has been that and so much more to us. We should show that same love and care and respect to others. So only through Christ, through the power of Christ in us, through the forgiveness that he gives us, can we even hope to bring peace to the situations that we have in everyday life. So how do you deal with that then? What do you do? I want to give us some practical examples of how we can then bring peace to situations in our life. So before you ever go and confront the person, there's 3 things that I think you need to do, 3 steps to peace that'll be very helpful for us if we do these things. And so here they are. First one, 3 steps to peace. The first one is this: honor God. First and foremost, you want to honor God. You need to ask yourself when your conflict arises and you're tempted to fight or you're tempted to run, you got to ask yourself, how can I honor God most in this situation? Now that's hard to do. When you're upset, when you're angry, that's really hard to pause and go, okay, I'm going to get my focus off of all my stuff and focus on God. How can I honor him in this? But if you do that, it's going to change the game. How can I honor God in this situation? Look at this. When Paul's writing to the church when they were debating and having conflict over what kind of foods you could eat and what was clean and what was unclean and what we can do and what we can drink. And here's what Paul writes to kind of sum it up in 1 Corinthians 10:31. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. So in our conflict, we just need to do everything that we can to glorify God in that situation. And when you do that, again, it takes our eyes and focus off of the issue, and it takes your eyes and focuses on God, and you'll see clearer how you should handle that situation, how God wants you to handle that situation. You know, is it honoring to God to steamroll that other person and win? Probably not. Is it honoring to God to deny that there's a problem that exists and just to run and to hide and stick your head in the sand and ignore it and deny it and put it away? Probably not. Is it honoring to God to humbly go before that person seeking peace and owning your side of the problem and asking for forgiveness? Probably. How can you honor God in this conflict? And we have to understand that conflict isn't always a bad thing. Every conflict is an opportunity for us to honor God and bring glory to God in that situation. You never know. You might be in conflict with somebody who's not a believer, and the way that you respond in a godly manner to give God glory and honor is going to be so surprising to them because no one has ever responded to them that way that they might even ask, what in the world? Why would you respond like that? And then God gets all the glory. So the first thing we need to do is we need to honor God. And the second thing that we need to do then is look for your log. Look for your log. Here's what I mean by that. You probably know where I'm going if you've been in church for a long time. Matthew chapter 7, verse 1 through 5, Jesus says this: judge not that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take that speck out of your eye where there is the log in your own eye? You hypocrite. First, take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Isn't that most fights nowadays? There's 2 sides to every single conflict, isn't there? The more you mediate conflict or try to help other people come to terms, you realize there's 2 stories to every single conflict. And often, more often than not, you're so focused on that speck of what they did wrong, that you don't even look at this log that you've got going on in your own eye. And you're not seeing clearly because you're only focused on their problem. So you're in the midst of a conflict. Instead of just focusing on what they did wrong, you need to say, where do I need to own this? What did I do wrong in this situation? Look, even if you can prove 99% of the problem is absolutely justifiably then, and here's the evidence, okay? What about that 1%? That 1% that you did wrong? You're still 100% responsible for that 1%. That's still your side of the equation that you need to own and ask for forgiveness. And when you go to somebody and you say, look, you don't just point out all the problems they did, and you say, hey, when you said that, the way I responded, I'm sorry, that was wrong of me. Will you forgive me? And you just let that hang. You'd be surprised how many times that other person will then come forward and own all their side of the problem, and you can have reconciliation and peace right there. Now, it doesn't always work, right? You know some of those people, they'll never admit they're wrong ever. Like hell will freeze over before they'll say that they did something wrong. And that happens sometimes. And so that doesn't always resolve the conflict, but you owned your side. You asked for forgiveness for what you did wrong. You came to the table and you brought and made a step towards peace to make reconciliation with that person. You're moving the right direction. But that doesn't always restore the relationship right away. So then what do we do next? So first we honor God. Second, we look for your law. And the third thing we do is we forgive long before you ever go to the person. Forgive. Think about this. How many people does it take to bring peace? 2. You can't have peace without both parties coming to the table. How many people does it take to forgive? Just 1. You can forgive somebody long before you ever talk to them. You can forgive to somebody long before the conflict is ever resolved. That's on you. You see, forgiveness, the way I like to think about it, is like canceling a debt. It's what Jesus did for us, right? When somebody has harmed us, when somebody's hurt us with something they said or something that they did, we feel like they owe us, right? You owe me an apology. You owe me my time back. You wasted all my time, and I'm upset about that. I shouldn't have been doing that for you. You owe me, maybe they broke something, right? You owe me money to fix this thing or to repair this thing, or you took this from me, and I feel like you owe me something. And so we feel like somebody owes us something, like there's this debt they have that they need to pay. And I'm going to sit here and I'm going to wait until they come forward and pay off this debt, and then I'm more than happy to forgive them. That's the way a lot of times we think, right? As long as they make the first move, restore, bring things back to normal, reconcile, right? Bring their restitution to us, then we'll forgive them. But what did Jesus do for us? We had a debt we could never pay. Our sin was far greater than we could ever be. We could never be righteous enough, holy enough, good enough. But Jesus, who is righteous and is holy, paid that debt for us. And he said, you're forgiven and you're free. And so how dare can we hold this debt over somebody else and not pay it and not say you're forgiven? That's what forgiveness is. It's saying I don't hold this debt against you anymore. All is forgiven. You owe me nothing. It's hard to do, but that's what Jesus did for us. And we need to do the same to other people. So we forgive. So now that we've gone through these steps, this is before you ever engage with somebody, right? You honor God, you look for your law, you find your problem, you own it, you admit it, and then you forgive that person the way that Christ forgave you. Then what do you do with that? How do you engage somebody now, right? How do you got a conflict, how do you deal with it? How do you engage? So I'm going to give us 3 rules for engagement that might be helpful for us too today. The first one is this. You got to ask yourself, is it worth the fight? There are a lot of conflicts that happen that aren't worth fighting over. Let's just be honest. Silly things, little things, stuff that's not that big of a deal, and we get so upset, right? Have you ever noticed that everybody is offended by everything? Like, it's scary, right? Like, you can't say anything. You can't endorse anything. You can't be like, I went shopping at this store. No, I'm offended, right? I like this person in the spotlight. No, I'm offended that you like that. I believe this. No, that's against my beliefs. I'm offended. Everybody's offended by everything nowadays. It's like, there's no way to not offend people. It just happens all the time. But some people get so offended by such a little thing, and we're holding it against other people because they offended us. And we got to ask ourselves, is it worth it? Is that worth getting upset over? And so when you come to a conflict, you got to ask, is this worth fighting for? If it's something that's minor, if it's something that's not that big of a deal, or maybe you're just really sensitive about that subject for that issue for whatever reason, but it's really not that big of a deal, maybe it's time to just overlook it, let it go, and forgive that person and move forward. There's other issues, though, that, look, if it's really serious, if it's harmful to you or to somebody else, or if it's just going to keep growing and getting worse and that conflict's going to keep building up, yeah, absolutely, it needs to be addressed. But for the other things, the little things in the world, man, you're going to get so bent out of shape and so bitter if you let everything offend you and upset you and make conflict with other people when it's something that's maybe they didn't even really mean it. Maybe they were just having a really bad day. Maybe they had no idea that was hitting a hot button of yours. That's something you dealt with in the past. And so when you do this, you're doing what Proverbs 19:11 says. It says, good sense makes one slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook an offense. Sometimes the most glorious and God-honoring thing you can do is just overlook the minor stuff. Doesn't mean you overlook everything, but sometimes the best thing you can do is just overlook an offense. Let it go. And this isn't running away from it. This is dealing with the conflict. It's dealing with the problem, but you're not dealing with it just with the other person. You're dealing with between you and with God. You're saying, God, help me forgive this person because this is really bothering me. And God, why is this bothering me so much? Why am I letting this little thing cause such an issue and so much stuff in my life? And you're giving it over to God, and then you're forgiving the person and moving on with your life. Because I tell you what, there's people like sometimes just bringing up a minor thing to somebody else creates more conflict than it's worth. I've had people come up to me before like, Brandon, I forgive you. I'm like, okay, thanks. What did I do? 3 years ago, you said this. I'm so sorry, right? Like, and there's more conflict, and it makes the relationship weirder because, like, I didn't even know. I'm so sorry, I would have done something if I knew. And so, it can cause a lot more things where sometimes it's just such a minor thing. It's like, just forget it and move on. Don't hold that grudge for years. So there you go. And so the next thing we need to do is first we got to ask, is it really worth the fight? Do we need to engage with this? And then if we decide, yes, this really is worth the fight, this really is something that we need to deal with, this is a conflict that needs to be resolved because the relationship's already hurt or whatever else is going on, then we need to go into this and we need to confront biblically. Okay, that's the key word there, biblically. Not just confront them biblically. How does God teach us to do this? What does the Bible say to do? Matthew chapter 18 gives some of the best advice for how to handle conflict. Jesus tells us this in Matthew 18, verse 15 to 17. Now he's talking about two people in the church, but we can apply some of this to other people as well. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you've gained your brother. So if somebody sins against you, you go to that person, just you and them, and you talk to them alone. You address the issue, and if they listen, you can reconcile right there. Beautiful, wonderful, that's amazing. But if you call them out in front of all their friends and everybody else in the room, you moron, you did this, how's that going to go? Not well, right? If you go and say, I've got a problem with you, and you're in front of a bunch of other people, that's just going to make them embarrassed. That's going to make them defensive. They're going to be on their back foot. There's going to be more conflict and fighting there. I learned this in years of youth ministry. If I had a student who was being really disruptive or rowdy or was a problem and I called them out in front of the entire group, guess what? Didn't go well. They just get more rowdy and more upset because I hurt their pride, I embarrassed them in front of their friends, whatever else. But if I pulled that person aside and just said, hey, bro, you got to knock that off. Come on, man. Stop doing that. And I just gave them the respect of having a private conversation that way, more often than not, the situation was resolved and things were good. So you go to the person. You talk to them one-on-one. You try to resolve the conflict right there. Not getting everyone else involved and stirred up and gossiping about it. You just go to that person and talk to them. Now notice it says go to that person. It doesn't say write them an email. It doesn't say text them, okay? It doesn't say use digital pictures on a screen, right? Pixels. That's not the way to resolve conflict. Okay, I could go off on this forever, but that never works. All it does, you ever had a bad email or a text message that offended you, right? Somebody tried to fix a conflict over text or email. It's awful. All you do is you end up reading and rereading and reading everything into every sentence and pointing out every flaw of what each word they should have chose, that they should have chose a different word, right? Or you can't understand their tone, you can't understand their heart, you can't read their body language. That's not human communication as well, right? You read the email and you go, it says, have a nice day. And you're like, have a nice day. Can you believe they said, have a nice day? Have a nice day, right? And you should start going off on it, and really their heart was like, hey, have a nice day. But you read it differently. Don't do that. Okay, go to people in person. It's always so much better. And I could go off on that forever, but we got no time, so I'll keep reading. Verse 16. But if he does not listen, you take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. This isn't to bully them or to gang up on them. This is bringing other witnesses who saw the problem, who could help speak into that, who could help mediate the conflict, maybe even point out where you did something wrong because they saw it. You bring some wise people into the situation who are witnesses of it, or you get some godly men and women who can come in and help speak to the situation and help you resolve that conflict. And then in verse 17, it says, if he refuses to listen to them, and now this is just for Christians, okay? Don't do this with your non-believer friends at work. But if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. If they refuse to listen to the church, treat them like a Gentile and tax collector. How do we do that? Treat them like a non-believer. How do we do that? You pray for them and you love them, but you don't expect them to act like Jesus. You don't expect them to act like a believer. You don't hold that over them. And that brings me right into the third step of rules of engagement. After confronting a person biblically, say you can't restore the relationship, it doesn't work, you don't resolve the conflict, there's still not peace in that relationship. The third thing you do is you love your enemy. That's what Jesus taught us to do. You pray for them and you love them. Matthew chapter 5, verse 43 to 47 says, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. Right? Blessed are the peacemakers, that they would be called sons of God. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the unjust and the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brother, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? If you only like people who like you, then you're just like everybody else. But if you love people who don't love you, if you love people who have conflict with you and don't like you, that's when you're being a peacemaker. That's when you're being more like Christ. Because even when we were enemies of God, he still came and loved us enough to come down and save us. And we need to treat others the same, to the best of our abilities. Keep on loving people. Keep on praying for people. Don't give up. Keep trying to make peace in that relationship. So here's the point. Jesus gives us the power for peace. And will you be a peacemaker? Will you be people who make peace in this world? It's worth our every effort. As Ephesians 4:3 says, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Would you pray with me?